Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a test of survival. Imagine this. You're lying on a thin layer of straw, covered by a scratchy wool blanket that smells faintly of sheep and smoke. The wind howls outside, finding every crack in the walls. Your breath forms small clouds in the darkness. There's no thermostat to adjust, no electric blanket to reach for. No heated mattress pad humming quietly beneath you. Tonight, we're exploring how medieval peasants, the vast majority of people who live between roughly 500 and 1500 CE, actually slept through the coldest winters Europe had ever seen. We're talking about the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped so low that the Thames River in London froze solid enough for frost fairs. When wine froze in barrels. When people woke to find their hair frozen to the walls. And these people had no central heating, no insulation beyond mud and straw, no flannel pajamas from Target. You might be lying in your comfortable bed right now, maybe with a fan going for white noise, maybe with the heater set to exactly 72 degrees. Remember that comfort. Hold on to it, because we're about to discover just how differently your ancestors experienced the simple act of going to sleep. The medieval peasant, let's call her Maud, a common name then, would finish her day as the sun disappeared around 4 in the afternoon during deep winter. She'd already been awake since before dawn, working in fields that were frozen solid, tending to animals, hauling water from a well that might be partially iced over, preparing the single hot meal her family would share. By nightfall, she was exhausted, bone-tired in a way most of us never experience. And the cold was just beginning. Here's a fact that historians love to debate. The average medieval peasant dwelling was probably kept at temperatures between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest nights. Some scholars argue it was even colder. Others insist that with a properly maintained fire and enough bodies packed together, temperatures could reach the low 50s. Either way, you're sleeping in what is essentially a refrigerator. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're willing, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo might be drifting off while someone in Sao Paulo is just starting their evening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The thing about medieval winter sleep that surprises most people is this. It wasn't really about warmth. It was about surviving until morning. Peasants didn't expect to be comfortable. Comfort, as we understand it, wasn't even a concept that existed for them. They expected to be cold. They expected to wake up multiple times during the night, shivering. They expected their children to cry from the chill. What they hoped for was simply to wake up at all. Here's an eccentric detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. Some peasants would sleep with their mouths covered by cloth or their hands, not for warmth exactly, but because breathing in extremely cold air all night could lead to respiratory problems. The moisture from their breath would freeze in their beards or on the cloth. By morning, some people's facial coverings would be stiff with ice. Imagine waking up to that. You'd peel the frozen cloth away from your face, feeling the sting of cold air on your skin, and immediately start trying to revive the fire that had died down to almost nothing during the night. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand the space where all this sleeping happened. The medieval peasant hut wasn't like the cozy cottages you see in fantasy movies. It wasn't charming. It wasn't quaint. It was dark, smoky, cramped, and barely warmer than the outside. Historians still argue whether the average peasant dwelling had any windows at all. Some say small openings covered with oiled cloth or animal bladder let in a bit of light. Others insist that windows were a luxury, and most huts were lit only by the fire and perhaps a single tallow candle on special occasions. What we know for certain is this. When night fell, darkness fell with it. Complete. Absolute. The kind of darkness that modern people rarely experience, broken only by the faint orange glow of dying embers in the hearth. And in that darkness, as the temperature dropped and dropped and dropped, peasants like Maud would gather their children close, pull whatever coverings they had up to their chins, and try to find sleep, knowing that morning was still 10 or 12 hours away. knowing that the coldest part of the night, just before dawn, was still to come, but also knowing that they'd done this before. They'd survived countless winters, and they'd survived this one too, with nothing but straw, wool, and each other. The structure itself was the first problem. You're standing outside now, in your mind, looking at what passes for shelter. It's roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, maybe smaller. A single room that houses an entire family, mother, father, 4 or 5 children, sometimes a grandparent who's managed to survive past 40. The walls are wattle and daub. That means woven sticks, the wattle, plastered over with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. When it's fresh and well-maintained, it's not terrible. It keeps out some wind. It provides some insulation. But this is winter. The daub has cracked from months of freezing and thawing. Long fissures run along the walls like veins. Some gaps are wide enough to stick your finger through. And through every single one of those cracks, the winter wind whistles in. Imagine trying to sleep while cold air streams directly onto your face from a dozen different directions. You can stuff the cracks with rags, with moss, with more straw. Peasants did exactly that, but it was never enough. The wind always found a way. The roof is thatched, layers of dried reeds or straw, bundled and layered to shed rain. In summer, it's actually quite effective. In winter, it becomes a different problem entirely. Snow piles on top, adding weight. Ice forms along the edges. And if the thatch is old or poorly maintained, which it often was, bits of it fall down inside. You're trying to sleep, and frozen pieces of straw are landing on your face. Here's a well-known historical fact. The typical peasant dwelling had a dirt floor. Not wood, not stone, just packed earth, sometimes covered with a layer of rushes or straw that was changed maybe once or twice a year. That floor conducted cold like you wouldn't believe. The ground itself was frozen solid from November through March in most of northern Europe. And that freeze came right up through the floor, through whatever thin layer of straw covered it, and into the bodies of anyone lying there. Modern people don't really understand what it means to sleep on frozen ground. We have mattresses, box springs, bed frames. Even camping, we have sleeping pads, insulated mats, air mattresses. Medieval peasants had straw. Just straw. Sometimes bound into a rough mattress if you were comparatively well off. More often just loose, piled on the floor, compressed by body weight until it was almost as hard as the ground itself. And here's an eccentric detail that historians love to point out. That straw wasn't clean. It was the same straw that animals had bedded in. It was full of fleas, lice, and other insects that went dormant in the cold but never fully disappeared. Peasants didn't have the option to be particular about bedding hygiene. You slept in whatever you had, and you were grateful for it. The single room served every function. Cooking happened there, around the central hearth. Eating happened there. Any kind of craft work or repair work happened there during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. Animals might be brought inside on the coldest nights. We'll talk more about that later. And sleeping happened there. There was no bedroom, no private space, no door you could close for quiet or warmth or solitude. Everyone in the family witnessed everyone else's existence, every hour of every day. Historians still argue whether this constant proximity created stronger family bonds or simply made people more tolerant of each other out of sheer necessity. Some scholars point to medieval writings that suggest genuine affection and closeness. Others note the high rates of domestic conflict documented in manor court records. Probably both were true. When you're that cold, that tired, that focused on survival, emotions become complicated. The hut had one door, a simple wooden affair that hung on leather hinges or iron if the family was fortunate. It fit poorly. Gaps around the edges let in wind and sometimes snow. There was no lock, just a simple latch, because honestly, what did peasants have worth stealing? Some huts had a small window opening, maybe a foot square, covered with oiled cloth or scraped animal membrane that let in a bit of murky light. Others had nothing, just the door, and whatever light came through gaps in the walls and roof. At night, with the door closed and no moon, the darkness was complete. Your eyes couldn't adjust because there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was absolute. Only the faint glow of embers in the hearth provided any reference point at all. And in that darkness, in that cold, in that single cramped room with its cracked walls and frozen floor and leaking roof, entire families would settle down to sleep, knowing the walls wouldn't hold out the cold, knowing the floor would leach heat from their bodies all night, knowing they'd wake up stiff and aching, but also knowing there was nowhere else to go. This was shelter. This was home. And inadequate as it was better than being outside, where the cold could kill you in hours. The architecture of the peasant hut wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for survival, for keeping out predators and the worst of the rain, for providing a place to maintain fire. Warmth was secondary, always secondary, and sleep was something that happened despite the conditions, not because of them. Now we moved to the center of the room, the hearth. Everything revolved around it. Literally, the entire layout of the hut, the placement of sleeping areas, the flow of daily life, all of it oriented toward that single source of heat and light. It wasn't a fireplace like you might imagine. There was no chimney in most peasant huts, no bricks around, no mantle, just a shallow pit in the dirt floor, sometimes lined with stones if the family could gather them, sometimes not. The fire sat directly on the earth, and smoke rose up through the room, slowly finding its way out through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. Emphasis on slowly. Medieval peasant huts were chronically smoky. Your eyes would sting. Your throat would hurt. Everything, clothes, hair, skin, food, smelled of wood smoke constantly. Respiratory problems were common, but the alternative was freezing to death. So you breathed the smoke. Here's a well-known historical fact. Peasants burned whatever they could find. What was the preference? Obviously. But what was also valuable? It was used for building, for tools, for repair work. In many regions, forests were controlled by lords or the crown, and taking wood without permission was poaching, a crime that could be punished severely. So peasants supplemented with other fuels. Peat, if they lived in boggy areas. Dried animal dung, which burned hot and surprisingly long. Straw and dry brush, anything that would produce heat. The problem was that none of these fuels burned as cleanly or as hot as good seasoned hardwood. They produced more smoke, more ash, less heat per volume. And on the coldest nights, you went through fuel at an alarming rate. Imagine, you've gathered enough wood and peat to last the winter. You've calculated carefully, rationed it out. But then a cold snap hits. The kind where the temperature drops to 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit for a week straight. Suddenly your carefully rationed fuel is disappearing twice as fast. Do you burn more to stay warm, risking running out before spring? Or do you ration even more strictly, enduring worse cold now to ensure you'll have something later? These were life and death decisions, made every winter, by every peasant family. The hearth fire was never supposed to go out completely. Ideally, you'd bank it at night, covering the embers with ash to slow the burning, to preserve coals that could be revived in the morning. Starting a fire from scratch was time-consuming and difficult. You needed a spark, tinder, patience. So you kept it going. Through the night, the banked fire would produce minimal heat, enough to keep the absolute worst of the cold at bay, enough that the temperature inside the hut stayed above freezing, usually. Here's an eccentric detail. Some peasants kept a perpetual fire tradition, where the hearth was never allowed to go completely cold, sometimes for years. It was partly practical, easier to maintain than to restart, but it also had cultural and almost spiritual significance. The hearth fire represented the heart of the home. Letting it die completely was considered unlucky. Of course, sometimes it died anyway, because fuel ran out, because someone forgot to bank it properly, because the wind blew through the hut and scattered the embers. And then morning came cold and dark and stayed that way until you could coax flame back into existence. The heat distribution from a central hearth was terrible by modern standards. If you were lying within 6 feet of the fire, you might feel genuine warmth on the side facing it. The other side of your body would still be cold. Beyond 10 feet, the heat barely reached you at all. So sleeping arrangements became a calculation. The warmest spots, closest to the hearth, might go to the smallest children or the elderly, those most vulnerable to cold. Or they might go to the adults who needed to stay healthy to work. Or everyone clustered together regardless, sharing heat more than relying on the fire. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants understood heat physics in any practical way, or whether sleeping arrangements were based more on tradition and social hierarchy than thermal efficiency. What's clear is that they tried everything. Different families had different strategies, and probably all of them were cold anyway. The light from the hearth was just as important as the heat. Once the sun set, which happened around 4 in the afternoon in deep winter at northern European latitudes, that ember glow was often the only illumination. Candles were expensive. Tallow, rendered animal fat, could be used, but it smelled terrible and burned poorly. Beeswax was better, but far too costly for peasants. Rushlights, dried rushes soaked in fat, provided a weak, sputtering flame that lasted maybe an hour. Most nights, the fire was it. And as it died down, as you banked it for the night, the room grew darker and darker until you were lying in almost complete blackness. Just a faint red glow of buried embers, pulsing slightly as air moved through the room. That glow became a focal point, something to orient yourself by in the darkness. You could tell time, roughly, by how much the fire had died down. You could gauge the temperature by how visible the coals still were. And lying there, cold and tired, watching that faint light slowly fade, you'd pull your blanket tighter, feel your family breathing around you, and wait for sleep to come, knowing that in a few hours, someone would need to wake up and add more fuel to keep the heart of the home beating through another frozen night. Let's talk about the physics of survival. When the fire dies down and the walls can't keep out the cold, and you have no insulation except what you've cobbled together from straw and worn fabric, there's one heat source left: each other. Human bodies generate heat. Not much, roughly 100 watts at rest, about the same as an incandescent light bulb. But when you put 5 or 6 human bodies together in close proximity, that becomes 5 or 600 watts. Medieval peasants understood this instinctively. They slept together, not in separate beds with privacy and personal space. Those are modern luxuries, modern concepts. They slept in a shared bed if they had one, a simple wooden frame with rope supports and a straw-filled mattress. Or more commonly, they slept on the floor, on pallets, on piled straw, right next to each other, sometimes touching, often touching, children tucked between parents, older siblings sharing space with younger ones, grandparents, if they were still alive, integrated into the arrangement. The goal was to create a collective warm zone. Here's a well-known historical fact. Medieval beds, when they existed, were significantly smaller than modern beds. A great bed that could sleep an entire family might be 6 feet by 6 feet. Everyone piled in together, lying crosswise if necessary, overlapping, sharing warmth. Privacy wasn't part of the equation. The bed itself, if you had one, was precious. The wooden frame was valuable, what always was. The mattress, even if it was just a cloth sack stuffed with straw, represented effort and resources. Beds were sometimes listed in wills, passed down through generations. That's how valuable they were. But most peasant families didn't have beds at all. They had floor space and whatever they could pile on it to create a barrier between their bodies and the frozen ground. You'd lay down straw first, a thick layer if you had enough. Then maybe an animal hide, a sheepskin if you were fortunate, which provided excellent insulation. Then rough linen cloth or more straw. And then bodies, arranged strategically. The coldest sleeper on the inside, surrounded by others. Or the smallest child, most vulnerable to cold, nestled between warm parents. Or everyone in a row, like sardines, each person's front warmed by the person in front, each person's back warmed by the person behind. Medieval people talked about sleeping spoon fashion. Yes, that term is medieval. They invented it out of necessity. Here's an eccentric detail that surprises people. Medieval peasants often slept sitting up or semi-reclined rather than fully horizontal. This was partly practical. It was easier to breathe when the air was full of smoke and you weren't lying flat. But it also meant you could pack more people into a smaller space. Imagine 5 people sitting with their backs against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in a single large blanket or animal hide that stretched across all of them. Everyone staying warmer because no one was isolated. The sleeping arrangement changed throughout the night. Someone would get too hot, somehow, and shift away. Someone else would get cold and press closer. Children would wake up crying from the cold and be pulled tighter into the huddle. It was a constant adjustment, a negotiation between comfort and survival. Historians still argue whether this enforced intimacy strengthened medieval family bonds or whether people simply tolerated it out of necessity. Medieval sources don't talk much about it. It was so normal, so universal, that it wasn't worth commenting on, like asking fish to describe water. But we do have occasional references. Complaints about someone who thrashed in their sleep. Mentions of illness spreading quickly when everyone slept so close. References to arguments about sleeping position and blanket distribution. They were human. They dealt with human problems, even in conditions we can barely imagine. The shared sleeping arrangement had another advantage: safety, not from the cold, but from everything else, from animals that might get inside, from the very real fear of the dark that existed before artificial light. When everyone slept together, you knew where your children were. You could hear them breathing, feel them shift and move. If something went wrong, if the fire went out completely, if someone became ill, if a storm tore part of the roof, you'd all know immediately. You'd face it together. There's something almost beautiful about that, if you look at it right. This forced intimacy, this absolute dependence on each other for survival. No one could make it alone through a medieval winter. You needed your family. You needed their warmth, literally, and they needed yours. So you'd settle down in the darkness after the fire was banked, after the last adjustments to blankets and positions. You'd feel your daughter's head against your shoulder, your son's feet near yours, both of you trying to share warmth. Your partner's breathing steady beside you. And despite the cold, and you were still cold, make no mistake, there was a certain security in it, a certain rightness. This is how humans survived winter for thousands of years. Not by conquering the cold, but by facing it together, body against body, breath mingling in the frozen air, hearts beating in the darkness, waiting for morning. Now let's talk about what they actually wrapped themselves in. Because when you think blanket, you're probably imagining something soft, something purchased from a store, machine-woven, maybe fleece or cotton, something that emerged clean from a washing machine last week. Medieval peasants had none of that. What they had was wool, rough, scratchy, often poorly processed wool that still smelled like the sheep it came from. Wool that had been sheared, cleaned minimally, carded by hand, spun into yarn, and woven on a simple loom. This was a laborious process. It took weeks of work to produce a single blanket. Every peasant woman knew how to spin. It was done constantly during any idle moment. The term spinster comes from this. Unmarried women spun thread. Everyone spun thread. And then it was woven. The resulting fabric was thick and heavy. Not soft, not smooth. The fibers were coarse and uneven. But it had one critical advantage. Wool retains warmth even when damp. And damp was a constant condition. Here's a well-known historical fact. Medieval peasants rarely washed their bedding. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream. Heating water required precious fuel. Soap was expensive and often unavailable. So blankets and sleeping clothes got washed maybe once or twice a year, if that. They accumulated sweat, oils from skin, dirt, smoke residue. They became stiff and discolored, but they still provided warmth. A typical peasant family might own 2 or 3 wool blankets total. That's it, for 5 or 6 people. So layering and sharing became essential. One blanket under the sleeping bodies, separating them from the straw and cold floor. 1 or 2 on top, stretched across everyone. Never enough. On the coldest nights, you supplemented with whatever else you had. Cloaks and outer garments became extra blankets. Tunics and dresses were layered over bodies instead of being removed for sleep. Medieval people often slept in their clothes. All of them. Because undressing meant losing precious warmth, and getting dressed in the morning in a freezing hut was miserable. So you stayed clothed. You might loosen a belt or unlace something for comfort, but you kept your layers on, and you added more. Here's an eccentric detail. Animal skins were prized as sleeping covers. Not the tanned, processed leather you might find in a fancy medieval household, but rough hides with the fur still attached. A sheepskin was valuable. A deerskin was treasure. These were draped over sleeping families like quilts. The fur side faced inward, trapping body heat. The leather side faced outward, blocking wind that came through cracks in the walls. A good animal skin could make the difference between sleeping and shivering all night. But not every family had one. Straw served as both mattress and blanket. Yes, you piled more loose straw on top of yourself. It sounds absurd, but it worked somewhat. Straw creates air pockets, and air is an insulator. So you'd burrow into a pile of straw like a nest, like an animal hibernating, which, in a sense, is exactly what medieval peasants did every winter. Linen was used for sheets in wealthier peasant households. It was cooler than wool, which seems counterintuitive for winter, but a linen sheet between your skin and rough wool blankets made sleep more bearable. The scratching and itching were constant problems otherwise. But again, linen was expensive. It required growing flax, processing the fibers, spinning, weaving. Many peasant families used linen only for special garments or patches. For sleep, they made do with wool directly against skin. And they itched. All night. Every night. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had tougher skin and higher tolerance for discomfort, or whether the constant irritation was just accepted as normal. Probably both. When survival is the priority, comfort becomes negotiable. The quality of textiles varied wildly. A well-off peasant family might have blankets that were relatively fine, tightly woven, maybe even dyed with cheap colors. Poorer families had blankets so roughly made they were barely functional, loosely woven with visible gaps, falling apart at the edges. And repairs were constant. Holes were patched with scraps of other fabric. Edges were rebound with strips of leather or cord. A blanket was used until it literally disintegrated, and even then, the remnants became rags for stuffing cracks in walls. Nothing was wasted, ever. Layering was the key strategy. One thin layer provides minimal insulation, but multiple thin layers trap air between them, and that trapped air is what actually keeps you warm. Medieval peasants understood this practically, if not scientifically. So you'd layer your clothes. Your cloak over your tunic over your undertunic. Your blankets, 1, 2, 3 if you had them. Straw above and below. Maybe an animal skin on top, creating a cocoon, a barrier between your body and the killing cold. And then, wrapped in all of that rough, scratchy, smoky textile, pressed against your equally wrapped family members, you'd close your eyes. Still cold. Always cold, but alive. And that was enough. Here's where it gets interesting. You're not alone in the hut. On the coldest nights, when the temperature outside drops below zero and the wind howls through every crack, the door opens again after the family has settled down to sleep. And the animals come in, not metaphorically. Actually, chickens, goats, sometimes a pig. Occasionally a cow if the family was wealthy enough to own one and the space permitted. These animals were brought inside to protect them from the cold. Because if your livestock died, you died. Eventually, through starvation. But there was an unexpected benefit to this arrangement. Animals generate body heat. More than humans. Actually, a goat produces roughly the same heat as 2 or 3 people. A cow produces even more. And that heat had to go somewhere. Here's a well-known historical fact. Many medieval peasant dwellings were designed with this in mind. Not all, but many. In some regions, particularly in Northern Europe, the house was divided, not by walls, but by function. One end for humans, one end for animals, both sharing the same roof and the same enclosed space. The animal's body heat would warm the entire structure, at least a little. In smaller, single-room huts, the arrangement was simpler. The animals just came in and found spots. Chickens would roost in the rafters if there were any, settling in with soft clucking sounds that became part of the nighttime soundscape. Goats would bed down in a corner on straw. A pig might root around for a while before settling. And the family would sleep with this menagerie. The smell was considerable. We need to talk about that. Modern people are very removed from animal smells. We encounter them occasionally at farms or petting zoos, and we find them unpleasant, strong, offensive. Medieval peasants lived with these smells constantly. The ammonia from animal urine, the earthy, musky scent of livestock, the smell of dung, even when it was cleaned up regularly, which it wasn't always, mixed with the smoke from the hearth, the unwashed human bodies, the moldering straw on the floor. The sensory experience was overwhelming. But humans adapt remarkably quickly. Actually, after a few days, your nose adjusts. You stop noticing the smell consciously. It becomes background, like the sound of traffic in a city or the hum of appliances. Medieval people didn't think their homes smelled bad because they had no reference point for unsmelly. Here's an eccentric detail that historians love. Chickens were particularly valued as bed warmers. Not to sleep with directly, that would be impractical and probably unsuccessful. But a chicken roosting near your sleeping area, or several chickens, would radiate gentle warmth all night. Their small furnaces metabolically, always producing heat to maintain their high body temperature. Some families would actually encourage chickens to roost directly above the sleeping area. The heat would rise up and then descend back down around the sleeping humans. It wasn't much, but on a night where not much could mean the difference between sleep and hypothermia, it mattered. The downside, of course, was chicken droppings, falling from the rafters onto sleeping people below. This happened regularly. Medieval sources mention it as a casual complaint, the way we might complain about a dripping faucet. Annoying, but not worth major intervention. You just dealt with it. Goats were even better heat sources, but more disruptive. They moved around at night. They made noise, soft bleating, the sound of hooves on the dirt floor. Young kids, baby goats, were especially restless. But a family with 2 or 3 goats sleeping inside had measurably warmer nights. The temperature difference might be 5 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like much, but it's the difference between 35 degrees and 45 degrees. Between brutal cold and merely uncomfortable cold. Between sleeping and shivering through endless hours of darkness. Historians still argue whether the health risks, diseases transmitted from animals to humans, respiratory problems from increased ammonia, parasites, outweighed the survival benefits. Some scholars say the medieval peasant lived in unsanitary conditions that shortened lifespans. Others point out that they survived through centuries of brutal winters, using whatever worked. Pigs were less common as indoor companions, mostly because they were larger and more difficult to manage. But in the coldest regions, or during the worst cold snaps, even pigs came inside. They'd be given their own corner, usually the one farthest from the sleeping humans. They generated tremendous heat. A full-grown pig is a furnace, but they also required more space and more management. The trade-off was calculated differently by different families. There's something almost cozy about this, if you can look past the smell and the inconvenience. The soft sounds of animals settling down for sleep. The rustle of feathers, the sigh of a goat lying down, the gentle snuffling of creatures finding their rest. You weren't alone in the darkness. Your family was there, pressed close. And your livestock was there too, sharing the space, sharing the night, sharing the struggle against the cold. All of you surviving together. The chicken in the rafters, the goat in the corner, the child tucked between parents, the ember glow in the hearth slowly fading. All warm-blooded creatures, all generating heat, all contributing to the collective survival of the household. And in that crowded, smelly, impossibly intimate space, sleep would finally come. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but alive, still alive, for another night. The transition from day to night required preparation. You couldn't just lie down and hope for the best. Surviving the night meant taking specific steps, performing small rituals that made the difference between cold sleep and hypothermic death. These weren't elaborate ceremonies. They were practical actions, repeated every single evening, as automatic as breathing. First came the fire. Around dusk, while there was still some light filtering through the door or window opening, someone, usually the woman of the household, would begin banking the hearth. This was skilled work. You needed enough embers to last through the night, buried deep enough in ash that they wouldn't burn out, but not so deep they'd suffocate. Too much ash, and you'd wake to cold coals. Too little, and your precious fuel would burn away by midnight. The technique was passed down through generations. Your mother taught you, and her mother taught her. You learned by watching, by trying, by failing on nights when the fire went out, and everyone suffered for it. Here's a well-known historical fact. Peasants would sometimes place heated stones near the bank fire. These stones, river rocks or field stones, whatever could be found, would absorb heat during the evening and radiate it back slowly through the night. Not much warmth, but on the coldest nights, every bit mattered. Some families had special warming stones that they'd used for years. Smooth from handling, blackened from smoke. Familiar. The stones would be positioned near the sleeping area, sometimes wrapped in cloth to prevent burns if someone rolled against them in sleep. By morning, they'd be cold again, but for a few precious hours, they helped. While the fire was being tended, others in the family worked on sealing the hut. Remember those cracks in the walls? During the day, you might leave some of them open for ventilation. At night, every gap became a channel for freezing wind. So you stuffed them. Rags, moss, dry grass, scraps, anything that could block airflow. You'd go around the entire hut, pressing material into every visible crack. Your fingers would get cold just doing this, working quickly before darkness fell completely. The door received special attention. It never fit properly, and the gaps around its edges were major heat leaks. Peasants would hang cloth across the inside of the door, creating a double barrier. Sometimes they'd pile straw or other materials against the base where the gap was largest. Anything to keep the wind out. Here's an eccentric detail. Some peasants urinated near the door before closing it for the night. Yes, really. The liquid would freeze quickly in the gap beneath the door, creating an ice seal that blocked drafts. It sounds disgusting by modern standards, but it was effective. And when you're freezing, dignity becomes negotiable. Windows, if the hut had them, were sealed tight. The oiled cloth or animal membrane covering was checked for tears. Sometimes an additional layer, a wooden shutter, a piece of leather, more cloth, was added on the coldest nights. Light didn't matter. You couldn't see anything after dark anyway. Warmth mattered. Only warmth. Then came the organization of sleeping spaces. This wasn't random. Families had strategies developed over years of cold nights. The warmest spot, closest to the hearth, but not so close you'd risk burns, might be reserved for the youngest child or an elderly family member. Or it might go to the primary worker, the father who needed to be functional the next day to provide for everyone. These decisions had weight. Social hierarchy, family dynamics, practical necessity, all of it played into who slept where. And on some nights, there were arguments. Tensions ran high when everyone was tired and cold and facing another miserable night. But eventually, positions were claimed. Straw was redistributed, creating nests. Blankets were arranged and rearranged. Animal skins were positioned. Everyone made their small adjustments, trying to optimize for warmth. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants changed clothes for sleep. Some evidence suggests they slept in the same garments they wore all day, as mentioned earlier. Other sources hint that people might remove outer layers but keep undergarments on. Probably it varied by family, by region, by temperature. On the coldest nights, you kept everything on, every layer. Sometimes people would even wrap cloths around their heads and faces, leaving only their noses exposed for breathing. This trapped warmth around the head and neck, where heat loss is significant. It also protected against that frozen breath problem we talked about in the beginning. Children were settled first, tucked into the warmest positions. They'd be told, probably every night, to stay still, to not thrash around, to keep the blankets over themselves. Children who slept restlessly were a problem, disrupting the careful arrangement of shared warmth. But children are children. They moved anyway. Parents learned to sleep lightly, to adjust automatically when a small body shifted or a blanket got kicked off. This was instinct by then. You woke up partially, made corrections, fell back into uneasy sleep. All night long. The last task before full darkness was ensuring water was accessible. Not for drinking during the night. That would mean leaving the warmth, but for mourning. A bucket or clay vessel was placed near the hearth, positioned so it wouldn't freeze solid by dawn, though sometimes it did anyway. And then, with the fire banked, the cracks stuffed, the sleeping positions claimed, the children settled, there was nothing left to do but lie down. Pull the blankets close. Press against your family. And endure. The darkness would come quickly. One moment, you could still make out shapes in the hut. The next, there was only the faint ember glow, pulsing like a slow heartbeat in the center of the room. And the cold would deepen, always deepening, through the long night ahead. But you prepared as well as you could, done everything possible, used every strategy your family knew, passed down through generations of frozen winters. Now came the waiting. For dawn, for warmth, for survival. One more night. But the worst was still to come. Not every winter night was the same. Most were cold, uncomfortable, miserable, but survivable. And then there were the nights that killed. The truly brutal cold snaps that arrived without warning. When the temperature plummeted to 0 Fahrenheit or below. When the wind howled with such force that even stuffed cracks couldn't keep it out. When morning felt impossibly distant. These are the nights peasants feared. You're lying there in the darkness, and you can feel it. The cold is different, deeper, more aggressive. It's not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. You can sense it in your bones, in the way your body starts to shake uncontrollably. The fire has almost died. The banked embers aren't producing enough heat to matter anymore. And you're running through calculations in your exhausted mind. Should you get up and add more fuel? But that means leaving the shared warmth, exposing yourself to even worse cold, using precious resources faster. Do you wait? Do you endure? These decisions had consequences. Here's a well-known historical fact. During the worst years of the Little Ice Age, particularly the 1430s, the 1690s, and the early 1800s, mortality rates spiked dramatically in winter. People didn't always die directly from cold. More often, it was the secondary effects. Weakened immune systems led to disease. Respiratory infections flourished in the smoke-filled, damp conditions. Malnutrition, because food stores ran low and bodies burned more calories trying to stay warm. And sometimes, people simply didn't wake up. Hypothermia is a quiet killer. It happens gradually. Your body temperature drops degree by degree. You become confused, lethargic. You stop shivering, which is actually a bad sign, meaning your body is failing. You feel warm, paradoxically, which is your brain malfunctioning. And then you sleep. Forever. Medieval sources mention this with heartbreaking casualness. A family waking to find a grandparent or infant cold and still. The weakest members, those least able to generate and maintain body heat, were most vulnerable. It happened more often than we like to imagine. On the absolute worst nights, sleep became impossible. You'd lie there for hours, shaking, teeth chattering, unable to relax enough for actual rest. Your muscles would be tense, burning calories to generate heat. By morning, you'd be exhausted despite never sleeping. And you still had to work, still had to function, still had to survive another day and prepare for another night. Here's an eccentric detail that shows up in medieval records. During extreme cold, some communities would open manor houses or barns as emergency shelters. The local lord, or sometimes the church, would allow peasants to gather together in a larger space where collective body heat made survival more likely. This wasn't charity exactly, it was pragmatic. Dead peasants couldn't work the fields or pay rents. Keeping them alive was in everyone's interest, but it only happened in true emergencies. Most nights, you were on your own. Rivers would freeze solid during these cold snaps. Wells would ice over. The livestock you brought inside for warmth might not survive anyway. You'd wait to find a goat or chickens dead despite being indoors. And if your animals died, your survival became even more precarious. No milk, no eggs, no wool for next year. Resources you'd counted on, suddenly gone. The psychological toll was immense. Knowing that you might not wake up, that your children might not make it, that this night could be the one where your preparation wasn't enough, where the cold finally won. Imagine that anxiety night after night, through an entire winter. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced depression and anxiety as we understand them today, or whether constant hardship created a different psychological baseline. What's clear is that winters broke people. Not everyone. Most survived, obviously, or we wouldn't be here. But some didn't. Some gave up, stopped trying to gather fuel, stopped eating, stopped fighting. And the cold took them. On nights when the cold was killing cold, families would make desperate choices. Burning furniture for fuel. Burning tools. Things they'd need later, sacrifice for survival now. These were impossible decisions. Burn the chair you spent weeks making, or freeze tonight. Use up next month's fuel ration, or risk not making it to next month. The worst nights revealed exactly how thin the margin of survival really was. One unusually long cold snap. One early winter before you'd gathered enough fuel. One leak in the roof that let in snow and wet your blankets. Any of these could be fatal. And yet, most mornings you did wake up. Cold, stiff, miserable, but alive. You'd force yourself to move, to revive the fire, to check on your family. Everyone accounted for. Everyone's still breathing. Relief would flood through you. Another night survived. The children would wake, crying from the cold. You'd pull them close, share whatever warmth you had left. The livestock, if they'd survived, would need attention. Water had to be found or ice melted. Food prepared. Life continued. Because it had to. There's something almost miraculous about this resilience. These weren't heroes or adventurers choosing hardship. They were ordinary people, farmers, laborers, mothers, children, enduring conditions that would hospitalize most modern people within hours. And they did it every winter, for their entire lives, generation after generation. The worst nights didn't destroy them, though they came close. Instead, they revealed something fundamental about human endurance, about what we can survive when we have no choice. When the only options are endure or die. Most chose endure. They wrapped themselves tighter, pressed closer together, waited for dawn with grim determination. And morning eventually always came, cold and gray and offering no comfort. But alive, still alive. That was enough. It had to be. But peasants didn't always face the cold alone. Medieval communities had strategies that went beyond the individual household. When the cold became truly unbearable, when single families couldn't generate enough warmth on their own, the village itself became a survival mechanism. You need to understand something about medieval villages. They were tight-knit by necessity, not just choice. Everyone knew everyone. Your survival depended on your neighbors, and theirs depended on you. This wasn't some romantic notion of community. It was practical reality. And on the worst winter nights, that interdependence became literal. Families would sometimes combine households. Not permanently, just for the coldest stretches. 2 or 3 families might crowd into the largest, best-insulated hut available. Yes, it was cramped. Yes, it was chaotic. But 15 people sleeping in one room generated far more collective heat than 5 people in one room and 10 in 2 others. The math of survival. Here's a well-known historical fact. Many medieval villages had communal buildings, barns, storage structures, sometimes a church or chapel, that became emergency shelters during extreme cold. These buildings, being larger, retained heat better than individual huts. On certain nights, you'd see families leaving their homes as darkness fell, carrying blankets and whatever supplies they could manage, heading toward the communal space. Like refugees, but only traveling a few hundred feet. Inside these shared spaces, the scene was extraordinary. 20, 30, sometimes 50 people packed together, sleeping on every available surface. Straw piled everywhere. Livestock mixed in with humans, because if the people were sheltering together, so were the animals. The noise alone would keep you awake for hours. Children crying, adults snoring, animals making their various sounds, coughing, shuffling, the rustle of straw as people shifted positions. And yet, it was warmer. Measurably, significantly warmer. The combined body heat of dozens of warm-blooded creatures raised the temperature by 10 or 15 degrees. Still cold by modern standards. You're talking maybe 45 to 50 degrees instead of 35. But that difference mattered enormously. That difference kept people alive. Here's an eccentric detail. Medieval sources mention sleep ambassadors, not an official term, but the concept existed. In villages, certain people became known for being easy sleeping companions. They didn't thrash around. They didn't snore loudly. They generated good warmth. During communal shelter nights, these people were actually sought after. You'd want to position yourself or your children near them. It sounds absurd, but it was serious business. Bad sleeping companions, those who kicked, talked in their sleep, or hogged blankets, became genuine social problems. In close quarters, these behaviors affected everyone's survival. There are medieval court records of disputes over sleeping arrangements during communal shelter nights. Arguments that escalated to violence. People were exhausted, cold, stressed. Tempers were short. Historians still argue whether these communal shelter nights strengthened village bonds or increased social tensions. Probably both, honestly. Shared hardship can bring people together, but forced intimacy can also expose conflicts. The local lord or the church sometimes played a role in organizing these arrangements. Not out of pure altruism. Remember those crocodile dung sunscreens? Medieval people were always practical. A lord who let his peasants freeze to death had no one to work his land in spring. So manor houses might open their barns or storage buildings. The church might allow people into the nave, though this was controversial. Sleeping in a sacred space wasn't taken lightly. But God, most priests reasoned, probably preferred living peasants to dead ones. Children adapted to this communal sleeping more easily than adults. For them, it was almost an adventure, sleeping in a strange place, surrounded by other children, the social hierarchy of home temporarily disrupted. But for adults, it was humiliating in ways we might not immediately understand. Your inability to keep your own family warm in your own home was on full display. Everyone could see your failure. Pride took a beating during these nights. And yet, you went anyway. Because survival trumped pride. Because your children needed warmth more than you needed dignity. The morning after a communal shelter night was its own ritual. People would disperse at first light, heading back to their individual homes. There was often a sense of sheepishness, of wanting to return to normal as quickly as possible. But there was also gratitude. You made it through. Together. These communal nights weren't frequent, maybe a handful of times each winter, during the absolute worst cold snaps. Most nights, you managed in your own home. But knowing the option existed, knowing your community would open its doors if necessary, provided psychological comfort, even on nights when you didn't need it. You weren't completely alone against the winter. Villages also developed informal rotation systems. If one family's hearth fire went out completely, a genuine emergency, neighbors would share coals to restart it. Small amounts of fuel might be lent during desperate times to be repaid later. This wasn't charity. It was mutual insurance. You help your neighbor today because you might need help tomorrow. There's something poignant about imagining these communal shelter nights. Dozens of people packed into a drafty barn, surrounded by livestock, wrapped in insufficient blankets, lying on straw. Still cold, still uncomfortable, but together, all breathing the same smoky air, all waiting for the same dawn, all surviving through the same desperate calculations. In the morning, they'd separate back into individual households, individual struggles. But for one night, they'd been a collective organism, generating warmth, sharing breath, refusing to let the winter take anyone. Not tonight, not if they could help it. And usually they could. Barely. But barely was enough. Now let's talk about what historians got wrong, and what medieval people themselves believed that simply didn't work. Because not every survival strategy was effective. Some were harmless superstitions. Others were actively dangerous. And modern scholars have spent decades sorting through medieval sources, trying to figure out what actually helped versus what people merely thought helped. The distinction matters. You're lying in the cold, trying anything that might work. And some of the things you've been told, things passed down through generations, are complete nonsense. But you don't know that. Here's a well-known historical fact that turned out to be mostly myth. The idea that medieval people regularly slept in sleeping closets or enclosed box beds that trapped warmth. This concept appears in some historical literature, and yes, these existed in certain regions, particularly in later medieval and early modern periods. But for the average peasant in the core Middle Ages, rare to non-existent. These were luxury items, expensive carpentry. Most peasants couldn't afford them. The romantic image of everyone snug in wooden box beds is largely Victorian fantasy, projecting later innovations backward onto earlier centuries. The reality was simpler and harder: straw on the floor. Another myth, that medieval people understood the concept of insulation in any scientific way. They knew, practically, that certain materials kept you warmer, but they also believed in some genuinely ineffective strategies. For example, hanging certain herbs from the rafters was thought to warm the air. It didn't. Herbs might smell nice, or at least different from the usual smell of smoke and animals, but they provided zero thermal benefit. Yet the practice was common, mentioned in multiple medieval household guides. People wanted to believe in simple solutions. Here's an eccentric detail that shows up in folk traditions. Some peasants believed that placing iron objects under their sleeping areas would draw warmth from the earth. You'd find old horseshoes, broken tools, scraps of iron buried in the straw. This also did nothing. Iron has high thermal conductivity, which actually means it would equalize to the ambient temperature quickly, making it cold to the touch in winter. There was no geothermal benefit in medieval Europe at typical peasant dwelling depths. But the belief persisted because occasionally someone would claim it worked, and that's all it took. Confirmation bias is timeless. Historians still argue about whether certain medieval practices had placebo effects that improve survival. If you believe the iron worked, did you sleep more soundly? Did that rest make you slightly more resilient? Possibly. Or possibly you just survived despite the nonsense, not because of it. Some practices were actively harmful. Sealing the hut too completely, for instance. Remember that hearth fire with no chimney? It produced carbon monoxide. In a completely sealed space, that could be lethal. Medieval sources document cases of entire families found dead in the morning, fires still smoldering, no visible cause. Carbon monoxide poisoning. They didn't understand the mechanism. The concept of toxic gases wouldn't be developed for centuries. They just knew, vaguely, that bad air from fires could kill. So most people left some ventilation, even if it meant being colder. The trade-off between warmth and breathable air was constant. Another dangerous practice: alcohol consumption before sleep. Medieval people knew alcohol made you feel warm, so some sources suggest drinking ale or wine before lying down in winter. This is terrible advice. Alcohol causes peripheral vasodilation. Blood vessels in your skin expand, making you feel warm temporarily. But this actually accelerates heat loss from your core. You feel warm while becoming more hypothermic. In extreme cold, alcohol consumption increases mortality risk significantly. But medieval people couldn't know this. They felt warmer, so they thought it worked. Some didn't wake up, and no one made the connection. Here's another myth that persists in modern retellings: that peasants regularly slept outside in haystacks or snow caves during winter. This appears in some medieval tales and legends, often with religious overtones, saints surviving through miracles, that sort of thing. Real peasants doing this routinely? Death sentence. Yes, hay provides some insulation. Yes, snow caves can protect from wind. But sleeping outdoors in medieval European winter without modern gear was almost certainly fatal. Those who survived such experiences were extraordinarily lucky, or the conditions weren't as extreme as claimed. The stories persist because they're dramatic. Reality was less exciting. People stayed inside, packed together, and barely survived. Some medieval medical texts suggested specific sleeping positions for warmth. Lying on your right side was supposedly warmer than your left. Facing east versus west made a difference, they claimed. None of this is true. Your sleeping position affects many things: digestion, breathing, circulation, but not your body's heat generation. These were attempts to create controllable variables in an uncontrollable situation. If you slept warmer one night facing east, it was coincidence. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We desperately want cause and effect. Historians still debate whether we should judge medieval people for these misconceptions. They were working with limited understanding, no scientific method, desperate circumstances. They tried everything, kept what seemed to work, passed it down. That some of it was wrong doesn't make them foolish. It makes them human. What had worked genuinely? The things we've discussed already: collective body heat, animal heat, layering textiles, banking fires carefully, sealing drafts. Simple physics, even if they didn't understand the theory. What didn't work? Superstitions, folk remedies based on magical thinking, practices that felt good but increased danger. And the tragedy is that people suffered and died because they couldn't distinguish between the two. They tried everything with equal faith, because what else could they do? When you're desperate, you'll try anything, even things that don't work. Especially things that don't work. Because the alternative is accepting that maybe nothing you do matters. That survival is random. That you're helpless. And that's psychologically unbearable. So you hang the herbs. You bury the iron. You drink the ale. You face east. And you tell yourself it's helping. Maybe it did, just not in the ways you thought. Maybe believing you had some control, some agency, gave you the mental strength to endure. And maybe that was enough. To make it through another night, into another cold dawn, still breathing, still trying, still human. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. Back to that peasant hut one more time. It's the deepest part of night now. Hours past midnight, hours before dawn. The coldest time, when the banked fire has burned down to almost nothing and body heat, is all that remains. You're lying there in the darkness, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of wool and animal hide pressing down on you, feeling the warmth of your family press close, your daughter's shoulder against yours, your son's breath, steady and rhythmic, somewhere near your feet. The cold surrounds everything, patient and relentless. But here, in this small pocket of shared warmth, there's something else, something that transcends temperature. You've survived thousands of nights like this. Your parents survived them before you, their parents before them. Back through generations, through centuries, through the long, cold millennia before history even began keeping records. This is the human condition, distilled to its essence. We are warm-blooded creatures, living on a cold planet, creating small pockets of warmth in the darkness. And we do it together. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of thinking about this philosophically. They were too tired, too cold, too focused on the immediate struggle of surviving until morning. But we, lying in our comfortable beds centuries later, can recognize something profound in their experience. They endured. Here's something historians have noticed. Medieval sources rarely complain about the cold the way we might expect. Oh, winter is mentioned. It's noted as difficult, as dangerous. But there's not the same sense of outrage or injustice that modern people might feel. Because this was simply life. Winter came every year. It was cold every year. You prepared as best you could, you survived as best you could, and you were grateful when spring finally arrived. Expectations shape experience. When you expect to be cold, when everyone around you is equally cold, when this is the universal human condition as far as you know, the suffering takes on a different character. Not less real, but less existentially unfair. You're not thinking, why is this happening to me? You're thinking, how do I make it through? And the answer was always the same. Together. The family pressed close in the darkness. The village ready to open its doors if needed. The livestock sharing their warmth. Even the fire, tended by human hands, banked with human knowledge passed down through generations. Everything connected. Everything interdependent. There's a comfort in that, strange as it sounds. Modern life offers us so much isolation, so much independence. We can survive alone in ways medieval peasants never could. We have central heating, individual rooms, private space. We're warmer than they ever were. But are we less alone? That's a question for you to consider as you drift towards sleep. In the medieval hut, the darkness is complete now. The ember glow has faded to almost nothing. Just the barest hint of red, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Outside, the winter wind still howls. Inside, there's breathing. Slow, steady breathing of sleeping humans. The soft sounds of sleeping animals. All these warm bodies, all these beating hearts, keeping each other alive through the long, cold night. Morning will come eventually. It always does. And when it comes, it will be cold and gray and uncomfortable. There will be work to do, survival to manage, another night to prepare for. But right now, in this moment, there's just the darkness and the warmth and the breathing. And that's enough. Lying here in your modern bed, with your adjustable thermostat and your soft blankets and your electric lights, just a switch away, you might feel grateful. You should. What those medieval peasants would have given for what you have. But maybe, just maybe, there's something they had that we've lost. That absolute certainty that you're not alone. That survival is a collective endeavor. That warmth, real warmth, comes not just from fire or fabric, but from the presence of others. From being together in the darkness. Maybe that's why these stories matter. Not just to understand history, but to remember something fundamental about being human. We need each other. We've always needed each other. And on the coldest nights, whether literal or metaphorical, that's what saves us. Each other. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable and warm and safe, carry that with you. The knowledge that you're part of this long chain of human survival. That countless people before you faced worse conditions and made it through. And they did it together, with nothing but straw and wool in each other. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Your breathing is slowing now, getting deeper. Your body is relaxing, settling into the mattress, into the warmth, into the comfort of knowing that morning will come and you'll be fine. The medieval peasant family is settling too, in your imagination, finding whatever rest they can, surviving another night through sheer endurance and shared warmth. The ember glow fades, the darkness deepens, and sleep comes, finally, gently, inevitably. To them, centuries ago, and to you right now, safe, warm, together across time. The night is ending now, both theirs and yours. In that medieval hut, someone will wake soon. We'll blow gently on those buried embers. We'll coax flame back into existence. We'll begin the process of surviving another day. And you, in your warm bed, will drift deeper into comfortable sleep. Or maybe you've already drifted off. Maybe you're dreaming now about cold nights and warm bodies pressed close, about survival and endurance, and the long chain of human existence that stretches back through time. We are all children of people who survived winters like this. Every single one of us. Our ancestors faced the cold and the dark and the very real possibility of not waking up, and they survived. Night after night, winter after winter, generation after generation. And here we are, the proof of their endurance, the validation of every cold night they suffered through. So sleep well tonight, knowing you're connected to all of that, to all those cold nights and warm bodies and shared breath in the darkness. Sleep knowing that humans have always found ways to survive, to endure, to keep each other warm when the world turns cold. And sleep knowing that tomorrow, when you wake in your comfortable room with your central heating and your soft blankets, you're experiencing a luxury that medieval peasants couldn't even imagine. A gift from all those cold nights that came before. A warmth earned through centuries of survival. Rest now. The night is deep and quiet. The darkness is complete. But you're safe. You're warm. And morning will come, as it always does, bringing light and warmth and the promise of another day. Sweet dreams.